I'm Chris Waddell. I'm the director of the School of Journalism and Communication. Welcome to what I know is going to be a very interesting evening. This is the 15th Kesterton Lecture. It's one of two public lectures that the school, I'm going to move this up because I have to be close to it. It's one of the two public lectures that the school does every year. The other one is the Paul Atella Lecture, named after one of our former colleagues. And it was last week at the Communication Studies Graduate Student Conference, which was right in this same room. The Kesterton Lecture is named after Wilf Kesterton, who was a key figure in the school in the early days, and in the early days in the growth of Carleton's journalism program. He was born in 1914, and initially he was a teacher. He joined the Army in 1942 as a private, and remained in the Army until 1947. At that point, he came to study at Carleton, and which I'm sure many of you know is Canada's oldest journalism program. And at that time, it had only been around for a couple of years when Wilf came. In 1949, he was the second faculty member hired by the school, and he taught media law and other subjects to virtually every student at the school from 1949 to 1979. He remained as a professor emeritus until 1986, and then he died in 1997. Not only was he an extraordinary teacher, he was a pioneer in the writing of journalism history in Canada and in examining the relationship between journalism and the law. So shortly after his death, the school launched a major fundraising campaign and supported by many of our graduates to create a Kesterton Endowment Fund. And it's that fund that supports tonight's lecture, among other things at the school. This is the third lecture that we've done in the River Building. It's our home since 2012, and it's quickly become the preeminent building on campus. And you can see why. Tonight, thanks to daylight saving time, you can actually see outside at 7 o'clock. And we have a wonderful view of the river, and there's a great atrium outside. And there's lots of space in the building for students to hang around and do things that students do when they're not in classes, which is great fun too. We're actually here for two reasons this evening. Certainly to hear CBC foreign correspondent Nahlah Ayed. But first, I'm pleased to announce the winner of the third annual James Travers Foreign Corresponding Fellowship, which is a $25,000 award to a Canadian journalist to fund a significant foreign reporting project that will appear in the Canadian media. And it's on an issue that's of relevance to Canada and to Canadian public policy. Following Jim Travers' untimely death in March 2011, his friends and colleagues decided that something should be done to remember Jim, and actually his extraordinary contribution to Canadian journalism, which spanned more than 30 years as a foreign correspondent, as an editor, and as a political columnist. Through hard work, a committee has raised more than $400,000 with an initial donation from Angus Reid as the lead donation. For the past 2 years, the committee has also run a very highly successful and hugely entertaining event in October, the Travers Debates at the National Arts Centre. That features politicians and journalists debating, but also having fun at each other's expense. And last October's evening raised about $60,000 for the fellowship. The first winner of the Travers Fellowship was in fact a former Carleton journalism student, Katie DeRosa from the Victoria Times Colonist. She traveled to Australia and Thailand and explored how Australia dealt with its refugee claimants, because at that time Canada was talking about doing some of the similar things Australia was doing in terms of detention centres and things like that for people coming to Canada and claiming refugee status. Last year's winner was Mike Blanchfield, who's here this evening, of the Canadian Press. He wrote about negotiating the international treaty to ban cluster bombs and also Canada's shifting position on that treaty. He went to Geneva, he went to Laos to actually interview people who actually had been victims of cluster bombs, many of which are still there. I'm pleased this evening to announce that the 2014 winner of the Travers Fellowship is Marco Chaunovid from the Toronto Star. I'll ask Marco to come forward and tell you a little bit about his project. Marco.
All right. Thank you, Chris, and thank you to the selection committee and also obviously to the Travers family for this opportunity. On the train ride over, I just came in from Toronto today, and I got to thinking about what a fellowship is. And in an industry that's all too focused on prizes, which are really the ends of ideas, where the congratulations that you get after you're done your work, fellowships are all too rare. And that's because fellowships are beginnings. They provide the critical support that you need to get an idea off the ground. And without a fellowship, many of these ideas I don't think would ever see the light of day. So while I'm honored to have my pitch selected to be supported as this year's Travers Fellowship, I'm also a bit anxious about all the work I've got ahead of me. When the International Cooperation Minister, Bev Oda, announced 2 years ago that Canadian aid dollars would be going to projects run with mining companies, many in the international aid community were scandalized. For them, working hand in hand with the extractive sector is tantamount to a deal with the devil. In exchange for opening up huge new potential donors, non-governmental organizations would have to give up their autonomy, they worried, and that this deal wouldn't be worth it. Corporate agendas would dominate legitimate development priorities, and fear of losing funding would silence critics. It's the ultimate sellout, and we read that in many op-ed pieces at the time. Yet, as government funding dwindles, new models for financing overseas development must be found. Amid tightening public budgets, leveraging public money with private funds seems like a good place to turn. So my project seeks to address a simple question. How will public-private partnerships change the way that Canadian aid projects are run? I will visit each of the 3 pilot projects in the coming months. Barrick Gold and World Vision working together in Peru, IM Gold and Plan working together in Burkina Faso, and Rio Tinto and Wusk in Ghana. In the 2 years since these pilot projects were first announced, the federal government has expanded on its strategy of bringing the private sector into the traditionally non-profit sector of international aid. The new vision involves leveraging private sector money to increase overall funding to international development, and this is an undeniably laudable goal. But it also openly states that developing Canadian economic interests abroad is now a parallel goal of the Canadian international aid. So pairing these 2 goals is a far cry from the single-minded approach that development's had for decades, which traditionally sought to reduce poverty, bar none, or full stop. The new development money is being redirected towards market solutions. And this is a quote from former CEDA Minister Julian Fantino last year. It's to help harness the power, resources, and innovation of the private sector for the benefit of the most vulnerable. When we help other countries advance their economies, we also create new partners for Canadian companies. So this approach is one that's been embraced wholeheartedly by other governments. US aid, which is the CEDA of the United States, gives out an increasing proportion of its international aid money each year in the form of public-private partnerships. And in a mirror image on the domestic front, Britain is pioneering PPPs in the delivery of domestic social services, working on things like probation and the rehabilitation of former inmates. So Canada is also studying social finance, not only in international development, but also in such sectors as Aboriginal housing and skilled trade training. I believe that some in-depth reporting is needed to get past the polarized talking points so that Canada can have an informed debate about PPPs and public service. I'd like to close by saying that while I never met Jim Travers, his body of work remains a testament to how intelligent reporting abroad can make an impact at home. This fellowship continues that tradition, creating a legacy of foreign reporting projects, and I sincerely hope that mine will live up to the standard that he set. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. He'll be here at the reception at the end of the evening, and I'm sure he'll be happy to talk to you more about some of his plans, and we'll be able to answer any questions you might have. But having done that, now we can turn to the main reason why you're here, and thank you all for coming. You've been waiting quite a while, and I don't mean just since 7 o'clock tonight. As many of you know, Nahlah Ayed was scheduled to speak at Carleton last September as part of our orientation activities. We had almost 400 people signed up who were going to come to hear her in the room next door in the big theater. But that was canceled at the last minute when events in Syria intervened and Nahlah had to go off to Syria. As soon as we announced the new date for March, it was clear that there would be a large crowd, and there is this evening. But something else happened at the same time, and that's we started getting calls in our office from people who saw her on television in the Ukraine and wondered, is she really going to come here? She's not going to be here on Tuesday, is she? Nahlah and I had spoken about a week or so earlier, and she told me she was going to Ukraine, but not to worry, she was still going to make it to Ottawa. So in response to all all the comments, I kept assuring people that yes, she'd be here, don't worry, but I was watching the National and watching her in Ukraine every night, and I had my fingers crossed. As you can see, I'm pleased to see crossing my fingers worked. Of course, no matter when we schedule a lecture, it would always be up in the air until the last minute for obvious reasons. Even in an era of Twitter, social media, and instant global communications, the core and essence of journalism remains what it has always been: being there, seeing things for yourself, talking to those involved, and reporting it to your audience what you see, hear, know, understand, analyze, and conclude. That's equally true and equally important, whether it's in Ukraine, Sochi, or Syria, and of the dozens of other places that our guest this evening has been in the last several years. Initially working as a parliamentary reporter for Canadian Press in Ottawa, for the past decade, Nahlah has covered primarily the Middle East for CBC. She's literally been everywhere that there's been a major story in the region during that period in time. And she's also, during that period, has been widely recognized for the work that she's done, both in terms of her journalistic work, and she's also received an honorary Doctor of Laws from the University of Manitoba, where she obtained both a master's degree in international studies and also a Bachelor of Science in genetics. But we know her more, though, as a graduate of our Master of Journalism program, one of several who've come back to deliver Kesterton Lectures during the year at Carleton. I've got my wrong page. Sorry, I've missed my pages here. I also learned firsthand how interested today's journalism students are in Nahlah and her career through last September's original attempt to get here and all the people who signed up. And more recently, in the fourth year course that I teach, I give all the students a list of about 20 books and say they have to choose one to do a book review during the term. About a quarter of the 45 reviews that I get done in the term choose Nahlah's book. Her book, A Thousand Farewells, A Reporter's Journey from Refugee Camps to the Arab Spring. There's a very clear message in that, I think, from my students, particularly the female students. And female students make up about 85% of our journalism program at the moment. They see Nahlah as a role model. They see what she has accomplished, and they hope to achieve the same thing as journalists after their graduation. Her story of growing up in Canada and the Middle East is compelling, and at the same time, the care and attention she puts into her reporting is obvious in everything that she's done. She draws on her own background and her own life experiences to skillfully explain a complicated region and its ever-changing politics to an audience in Canada. And it's a model for the best of what journalism should be. Our students see that and they respond accordingly. Many of them are here tonight. And we'll all have an opportunity to see that and hear that shortly. Please welcome Nahlah Ayed.
Thank you. Try to be still my beating heart kind of idea. I'm very tired, so I apologize if I don't make any sense or if I fall over. It's just jet lag, don't worry. Thanks very much for a very humbling introduction. And I really am glad to be here. I was just as doubtful that I was going to get here as some of you might have been. And thank you for forgiving me for canceling last time. So it's a good time to say to all of you, I'm really sorry for not being here last time, but I was really torn until the very last minute. I didn't want to miss this, but I had to. But it's a pleasure to be here now, and it's an honor to be here to give this lecture, in particular Kesterton, because without his decision to create the journalism school here, none of us would be here right now. And if it weren't for Carleton, actually, I wouldn't be standing in front of you today, completely confused about what I'm about to talk about, because as some of you must know, I'm here to talk about the Middle East. I can't help but be on top of what's happening in the Middle East. I'm always reading, I'm always looking things up. In the middle of the night, I'm tweeting things. But I haven't been there for a bit, because it's been a bit busy elsewhere. And being based in London now, of course, my area that I cover is a lot larger. So I come to you now, if you haven't been watching the Nationals, via Crimea. And before that, via Sochi, because I was one of 2 reporters who was covering news at the Olympics for the National. And my main task, if you weren't watching the National, was to cover non-sports news, if it happened. So there was, remember, there were concerns about possible security issues and that kind of thing. So that was my job. And I was supposed to also focus on Russia itself. I did a lot of that. I went into, speak to Russian people and find out about their interests and how they felt being kind of in the center of attention. But there wasn't much other news. So inevitably, this being a sports event, I was pressed into the service of writing sports stories. I suppose sport on some level is conflict, right? So I thought, why not? Especially something like ice dancing. They did make me do a couple of stories about ice dancing. It was fun because I found out, in fact, that ice dancing and conflicts in ice dancing could be just as bitter as any conflict you would see in the Middle East or elsewhere. So my experience in covering conflicts actually came in really handy. I had to do more than one story. I think there were 3 in the end, but I blocked them out of my head. But the experience did come in handy, I'm not joking. And I really did enjoy it in the end. It was a nice change from the usual. And I got to do hockey. I mean, who would say no to a hockey story, right? I am a Winnipegger, and I have a long history of watching Jets games, so this came a little bit more naturally to me than ice dancing. So I went to the ball show. You guys remember that really beautiful arena that had, the score showed at the top with the flags. I loved it. It was such an incredible game that I saw. It was the sad elimination of Russia from the tournament. But it came to a shock to my colleagues saying, hey, that wasn't a bad story. You can do hockey stories. I'm like, yeah, well, it's a story. So, story is a story is a story. I was a bit insulted that people would doubt that I could do a hockey story. But it's some of the best storytellers in this country actually are sports journalists. I've said this for years. Some of them, the most detail-oriented and most eloquent writers are sports writers. And they taught me, some of them taught me, one of my colleagues at Canadian Press, maybe you know his name, Bruce Cheadle, taught me that a storyteller is a storyteller, and a story is a story. And Carleton taught me that as well, which is one of the best reasons to kind of look back and think about what it was like to be here at Carleton, to remember how I learned this craft, and from the people like Chris Dornan and Lynn Van Leuven and Mary Maguire and Ellie Album, all these names that some of you might know. Lionel Lum and many others I won't remember. But my most vivid memories of being here at Carleton were specifically working at Centertown News, which some of you can relate to, I think, and of repeatedly getting yelled at by Klaus Pohl for skipping class to go to the Ottawa Citizen to freelance, which I thought was a better use of my time. Terrible to say, but I learned a lot from Klaus. And he wasn't the only one who was unhappy with me then, actually. Just before I came to Carleton, my father wasn't too happy that I was leaving behind my white lab coat and my work, with petri dishes and the genetics lab, a respectable job is what he thought it would be, and to move to Ottawa to pursue the crazy idea of becoming a journalist. He did get over that eventually, and he was thrilled when I graduated. He came here. And it was Peter Jennings that came and spoke at our grad, actually, then. He was very proud, and he was even prouder when I decided to work for the Canadian Press instead of go off to Nepal and make a documentary about an NGO's work. That was another one of my crazy ideas. Actually, it wasn't even my crazy idea. It was Lionel Lum's crazy idea. But my dad was happy that I let that go. So I worked on the Hill for 5 years, just giving you a little bit of information about my history here. And it was probably one of the most amazing 5 years of my life, because I worked with some of the finest journalists this country has ever produced, and some of whom are still friends and mentors to this day, and some of whom are actually in this room as well. So I might have gotten my master's at Carleton, but at Canadian Press, on Sparks Street, that was my PhD. So it was this wonderful school, this amazing city. That office on Sparks Street is what really made me who I am today as a journalist. And covering Ottawa back then was actually very exciting. was pretty complicated in those days, although I hear not quite as complicated as it is these days. But none of it, of course, is as complicated as covering the Middle East. That goes without saying. It's a region that actually grows more complex by the day. And it's always been complicated in the Middle East, for those of you who follow this, but not to the people who actually live and breathe it every day. I was one of those people for a period before the Arab Spring, when things were actually easy to predict. It was so easy that we could, this is not a joke, this is serious, but after Hariri was killed in 2005, there was a series of bombings that happened in Beirut. And they happened pretty regularly, not every second day or third day, but they happened pretty regularly. But we seriously could predict when they would happen. We could predict when some of these rogue groups in the south were going to lob rockets at Israel. You could almost count the days in between every incident and know exactly where the answer is. That's how predictable the Middle East was. It was like clockwork. And even ordinary people in the Middle East, you could stop anybody on the street and they could make these predictions for you. Here we go to universities and we go to think tanks to try to find experts, to ask them what they think, to look into the future. What is, the future that Canada looks like? But in the Middle East, you can stop anybody on the street, on the sidewalk, and they can give you analysis and predictions, just like any think tank or university professor. They sort of bring in geopolitical aspects and tell you how their lives would be affected by a certain problem and explain to you what America would think of it and what it would mean for the Arab world. Just any person, any shopkeeper. It's just the way it is in the Middle East because it's how people live over there, especially in Lebanon, I would say. Bar none, it has the region's best food, and it's a nation of analysts. And they make some pretty dire predictions when you ask them what they think is going to happen next. So you shouldn't be surprised to know that actually some of the best clairvoyants in the region, and there are quite a few, come from Lebanon. They're Lebanese. There's a man by the name of Nahlah Ayed. Anybody hear that name before? No? He's virtually a household name in Lebanon. I interviewed him a few years ago, and he famously actually predicted Princess Diana's accident. He also predicted the civil war in Syria. He's very famous in the Middle East. And he's had rivals over the years. There are many clairvoyants, but again, most of them are Lebanese. There's this woman recently who's appeared, who's become very popular. Her name is Layla Abdel-Latif, and she predicted that there would be bombs in central Beirut, which, as you know, there are often bombs in Beirut, but not in central Beirut. And so she, the veracity of her statements became mythical kind of as things got more and more dangerous in Lebanon. So she's been right on a couple of occasions, and people have been completely freaked out by her predictions. So when I was there last, actually, she managed with one of her predictions to clear the streets, literally. She said something was going to happen in the next 24 hours, and there were no people in the streets. That's how much they believed her. But even for people like her and for people like Nahlah Ayed, it has become much more difficult to predict what's happening in the Middle East because so much of the whereases and the givens have really changed. It's not the same region that it was 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. In a letter to the editor of the Financial Post, one observer by the name of K.N. Al-Sabah delivered this short guide of the Middle East last summer when we all thought, this is when I canceled, when we all thought that the U.S. was going to attack Syria, and I had to miss coming to see you. This is what he wrote, and it's such a perfect description of what's going on in the Middle East. He said, "Sir, Iran is backing Assad. Gulf states are against Assad. Assad is against the Muslim Brotherhood. Muslim Brotherhood and Obama are against General Sisi. But Gulf states are pro-Sisi, which means they are against Muslim Brotherhood. Iran is pro-Hamas, but Hamas is backing Muslim Brotherhood. Obama is backing Muslim Brotherhood, yet Hamas is against the U.S. On and on he goes, and he says, welcome to the Middle East, and have a nice day. It's a pretty big mess. It's easy to make fun, but it is very much like that. And I'm sure you're watching the news, and you see that there's a lot happening there. And you may not see every little bit of minutia because, and that's partly our fault as journalists, because we in the more established, larger media just don't have the bodies or the resources to be able to cover every part of the story. But the overall picture does look pretty distressing. I think you'd agree with that. There's kind of this fatalistic resignation in the Middle East right now that after all the predictions and how proud people are of making their predictions and how accurate they could be, sort of this resignation that really there's only two possible conclusions once you kind of look at the landscape and you think, God, what do we do with this? One is it's either in God's hands. That's one famous quote from people that you hear. They'll give you their prediction and then they'll say, well, it's in God's hands. And the other is what falls from the sky, the earth shall receive. Both expressions reflect the long history, I guess, of trouble in the Middle East. Sort of throwing up your hands is a popular way to cope, a coping mechanism, because so much happens that is outside people's control. There's nothing that they can do about it but live through it. It explains, I guess, also the amazing capacity of people in that region to muddle through despite all that happens there. And to try to carry on despite some of the worst setbacks. My theory before the Arab Spring was that there was very little hope in the Middle East because of these repeated setbacks. And some of you who've read the book will have seen that theme. I talk about this quite a bit. And there had been very little hope for a very long time because every time people dared to dream, every time they felt any sense of hope, every time anything was kind of looking up, something would come along and ruin it. It would be a car bomb or a disaster of some kind or an all-out war or a refugee crisis. There was always something that came along to stop people from hoping. They were afraid to hope. And as I've written repeatedly, the Arab Spring was that glimmer of hope. You guys remember this? It was an amazing, euphoric moment when these young people went to these squares and demanded something better, to get out of this gloom and this movie that kept repeating itself. So as the biggest hope to come to the Middle East in decades, in generations, in fact, it was the most fragile hope, as you can imagine. The most vulnerable, because it was the one that was most in danger of being dashed. I've said repeatedly that the consequences of that hope being dashed would be grave, and not just for the region, but for us here too, for the whole world. And I'm afraid that is already happening. That hope is in grave danger of being dashed. Because since the beginning of the Arab Spring, there have been major setbacks to the cause of freedom in the Middle East, arguably as horrific as some of those things that people went out to fight against in the first place. Obviously, the situation in Syria is one of the biggest and one of the most divisive in the region. And it's impossible to even imagine that what is happening in Syria even started with anything called spring. I mean, it's heartbreaking. And not least because it has effectively become a civil war, and one that it's drawn in regional players, which of course always complicates things. And it has drawn in sectarian sentiments. The whole region is divided along sectarian lines that have been really highlighted by this conflict. And we've seen the deluge of people out of Syria. I mean, it's endless. Millions, over 1 million children apparently. Just this week, we're told, as if we didn't know, that Syria is the most dangerous place on earth for children. It's a war zone, of course. So that's at the extreme end of the failures of the Arab Spring to deliver the kinds of results that people had been hoping for. There's no going back from that, and there's no easy fix to that, obviously. It's going to take years. But it's indicative of the kinds of things that are hindering the Arab Spring in other countries as well. So let's first agree that there is a long list of obstacles standing in the way of the hope right now. I mean, there's just no way around it. Much as I'm always accused of being too much of an optimist, and I find it hard to say these words, but I do find it is impossible not to acknowledge that there are a lot of things standing in the way of that hope at the moment. So here's a little bit, I guess this is kind of my sense of what is standing in the way. So I'll give you a sense of that. And then I'd like to, just to lift the spirit a little bit, is tell you of a few things that I see that actually might indicate otherwise, too. So we'll start with the bad, we'll go to the good. So the first thing is the continued and frankly shocking absence of political choices. Right now in most of the countries that went through the Arab Spring, as you know, there continue to only be two choices. One is the same old regimes, or the status quo, or some form of the old. For example, in Algeria, you guys probably have heard that Abdelaziz Bouteflika has announced that he's planning on running again for a fourth consecutive term as president after 15 years in the job. So we have that scenario, described actually by one writer in the Middle East as the most debilitating legacy of the modern Arab state system. Or you have the old regimes coming back as new ones, like in Egypt. You know, you have the military regime essentially coming back, but with a different face. The other choice are Islamist organizations. So that's the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, or other incarnations, and there's really nothing else credible in between. At least not yet. So it's pretty simple why that's the case. Of course, you know this if you were tracking the Middle East at the time, that the opposition forces were always painted as traitors. They were always seen as foreigners. They were always painted as American stooges. And so their protests were shut down, their leaders thrown in jail, etc. So under those circumstances, the only organizations that could actually meet up and places where people could meet or decide to feed the hungry or those kinds of things were mosques. That's how some of these organizations came together. And so we saw the growth of these Islamist organizations, which were always seen as kind of a natural beneficiary to any kind of chaos or revolution. In fact, they were seen as a natural revolutionary force. But as you'll remember, it wasn't them who started the revolutions in the Middle East. It was young secular youth who just wanted a better life, and they just wanted jobs and to get married. Many of them get engaged for years and they wait forever to get married, and that's, you imagine, frustrating. In any case, when the Arab Spring happened, it was inescapable that the Islamists would have to be tried out, and so that's what happened in Egypt, as you know. They were extremely organized, the Muslim Brotherhood. There was no way anybody was going to be as organized as they were, and they would win a free vote, hands down, there was no question. But thanks to the previous regime's stranglehold on power, what the Muslim Brotherhood had perfected was being an excellent opposition. They never really had a chance of learning what it's like to run a country. I lived in the Muslim Brotherhood Egypt for 3 months last year. It was an experiment that CBC decided to undertake, which was to set up these online bureaus where it would be a one-man or one-woman bureau, where you'd cover things for TV, radio, online. And so for 3 months, I lived in that Egypt that was ruled by the Muslim Brotherhood, and I reported them. It was impossible not to see the government's failures. They were there for everyone to see. Everything seemed to be going badly. The foreign reserves were running out. The currency was down. The market was down. People's spirits were down. Tolerance was down. I mean, it was not a happy place. And there were protests on top of that, and police brutality. But nowhere did we ever see a face or a new name or a young person or anywhere that came up and said, hey, I'm a third way, or I'm a third alternative. I'm somebody who could lead the young people and inspire them. It never happened. I never saw it. In fact, the old opposition, like the Brotherhood, didn't know how to be leaders, and they also had no experience ruling. And they didn't know half as well how to organize as the Muslim Brotherhood. And they did a terrible job of banding together as a party. So the lack of choice was really a big factor in how Egypt was sort of, lurching from police state, long ruled by Mubarak, to Islamist state, sort of half supported by the military, to back to a country that is effectively ruled by the military, which is where it stands now. So that's one. Number two, I would say, would be the outdated and brutal and shocking security forces that operate in the Middle East. It's a problem right across the region. whether the countries had been, quote, liberated or self-liberated or still ruled by autocratic governments, police just are not, or people are not just having to fight the regular problems that everybody has to contend with, which is just living, finding jobs, making sure they get good schooling for their kids, but they also had to fight against their own police, and with a fight against the persecution from their own police and security agencies, because almost all of them, not all of them, but almost all of them work outside the law with complete impunity. They act solely for the protection of the state. They protect the state from the citizens. And some of them have complete disregard for human rights. So this is a continuing problem that I think still stands in the way of people feeling like they have any sort of justice in the countries in which they live. And you might recall that, in fact, the Egypt revolution started because of this. The first protest that happened was on January 25th, 2011, and that was actually National Police Day. And the reason that protest happened that day, in case you didn't know, was because a young man by the name of Khalid Said, is 25 years old, was beaten and left to die in a stairwell because he had uncovered examples of police corruption. So these two cops beat him up and left him there to die. And he became sort of this rallying cry for young people. So on the 25th of January, people went out to protest against this, and that's where the revolution began in Egypt. And people in Egypt feel like that request for better police, for more effective police, still hasn't been met. That demand has not been met yet, 3 years later. There's been no change in the way security services operate. Some activists would argue that they need to wipe it all up and start from scratch, to get rid of the police force that exists now and start from the beginning, to produce a service that is built on the idea of serving people rather than the other way around. So that's number two. The third thing, which is probably the most disturbing given what I do for a living, which is state media control. This is a problem that has been alleviated a little bit because of social media, because in an unprecedented way, people around the Middle East are talking to each other, on social media, whether it's Facebook or Twitter and those kinds of things. But instead of trying to just control information or block websites or shut down networks, what governments are doing now is use intimidation to try to shape the way media covers things. It's always been a tool in their arsenal, but now it's a more important tool. It's really quite disturbing because it's led to self-censorship among many media. In Egypt, you might recall, there's sort of this pandering to the military since Morsi was brought down. Newspapers and especially TV stations started using this logo called, fighting terrorism after the Morsi government was brought down. And the Muslim Brotherhood disappeared completely from the airwaves. They just simply didn't exist anymore. They had a couple of stations that were loyal to them. Those were shut down. And very few of the others, I was there during all this as well, very few of the other networks would actually dare to interview a Muslim Brotherhood person just to get the other point of view. There's none of that thinking that you need to show both sides. Muslim Brotherhood voice was completely eliminated. And that's why you see Al Jazeera being targeted time and again in Egypt, because they are perceived as, they are actually the only network in the region that will interview Muslim Brotherhood or organization members. But it's why, as you know, there is a Canadian currently in an Egyptian jail. I don't know if you guys know this, Mohammed Fahmy, who's they're still on trial, those journalists, but that's the genesis of all of this. They're accused of helping the Muslim Brotherhood to spread their message and to sully Egypt's reputation overseas. And if that wasn't absurd enough, I don't know if you've ever heard of the name Bassem Youssef. Does that ring a bell to you? He's one of the most interesting interviews I've ever done in Egypt. He's basically the Jon Stewart of the Middle East. He kind of looks like him too. Actually, they really get along. Jon Stewart came and showed up on his show in Cairo. Look it up, it's hilarious. It's very funny, the two of them together. Anyway, he's a heart surgeon turned satirist. Talk about, I thought I was neat because I did genetics and went to journalism, but to be a heart surgeon and become a satirist. But he started this show called Al Barnameg, which means the program. And it was watched by 30 million Arabs. You can imagine how that's terrifying for a government, right? He had a heyday with Morsi. Again, if you look him up on YouTube, very funny. He was his favorite target. And he was intimidated then when the Muslim Brotherhood was still in charge. He was detained on charges of insulting the president and insulting Islam. And he had to go to court and fight those charges. And that was around when I interviewed him. And he wasn't really cowed by it. He just said, I'll go to court and I'll fight those charges. I'm doing my job. I'm just trying to be funny. When Morsi fell, Yusuf took a break, actually, and he went off the air for a few months. Then he came back, and the military was in charge. So what do you do if you're the Jon Stewart of the Middle East? You're going to make fun of the military, So that's what he did. Shortly afterwards, just minutes actually before his show went to air, they shut him down. And his home network actually did it. They happen to be called CBC. No relation to us. Because he had somehow violated some kind of journalism ethics code. That's what they said. He apparently upset Egyptians by attacking symbols of the state. That's what he was accused of. And get this, he was also accused of supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, the same group that he had just a few months earlier gone all out to make fun of as well. So this was extraordinary enough, yet Yusuf, being determined, dropped CBC and went and found another network. I mean, what network would not want a viewership of 30 million people, right? So he went and found another network. In fact, it was a Saudi-owned network. I told you it was complicated in the Middle East. And just 3 days ago, some of you might have heard about this, the signal of this network was deliberately jammed during Yusuf's show. Imagine Obama shutting down Jon Stewart, or imagine Stephen Harper or Rob Ford shutting down CBC because of This Hour Has 22 Minutes. I know that some people might want to do that, but as long as the Arab state or the Arab government thinks it's okay, or any government, I'm talking about the Middle East, but any government, to jam a network, a whole signal of a network, because of one man, admittedly with 30 million viewers, then the Arab Spring hopes are not fulfilled. Just one other note on that, too. Egypt is one of several Arab countries that have information ministries. Do you guys you know what an information ministry is? Some of us older people would know, but you guys probably have never heard of the information ministry. Yeah, it's they regulate our work as journalists when we go visit, but they also regulate the state media in places like Egypt and Syria, certainly, and Jordan and Lebanon and many other places. And so this is one way of these states of controlling local media. They're a tool of the government. And so as long as that continues, there's no way that press freedom or any kind of freedom can work in these places. And number 4 now is the continued exclusion of women from helping determine sort of the political future of their countries. And this is an issue that has been brought up. It's such an old issue. It's amazing we're still talking about this in any country, but the UNDP has consistently put out reports about the Middle East and saying that a big part of what's ailing the Middle East is that slightly more than half the population is essentially just being ignored when big decisions are important, are coming up. They're just not being called on to contribute. Of course, out of necessity, as you can imagine, and out of just motivation, many, many women in the Middle East are in the workforce. It's not like they're hiding at home. They're a big part of society, and they have worked in non-traditional, quote-unquote, jobs for many, many decades. But politically, women have not really been allowed to step up. You might recall that in Egypt, they really did play a big part in the revolution. I was there. I saw them. And every kind of woman. There were the young ones, old, educated, completely illiterate, ones in hijab, some even with the niqab, with jeans, and you name it. Every kind of woman was represented in that square. And yet, when I was living in Egypt last year, many women felt that their rights were being rolled back under the Muslim Brotherhood. First, of course, you might recall there was the matter of these public sexual harassment issues that were happening in Tahrir Square, where people were trying to protest. So this was, women felt that they were being deliberately targeted so that they don't participate in this process, they don't come to Tahrir Square and demand freedom. And so the easiest way to do that in somewhere like Egypt is these thugs who were going around Tahrir Square and preventing, sexually harassing women, and that way women just won't go. And it did happen. Women just stayed home because nobody wants to be that. Nobody wants to be harassed like that. So there was that issue, and there was also a constitution that was forced through in 2012, which barely mentioned women. There was only one mention of women. And the head of the National Council, actually, for women in Egypt told me that there was a minimum quota for female participation in the new parliament, which was completely ignored by the Muslim Brotherhood. And the concern was that when the Muslim Brotherhood sort of solidified its power with another election, that the rights that they'd spend years fighting for on child custody and divorce and those kinds of issues would all get rolled back. In response to those concerns, Morsi actually held a conference while I was there, invited women from different parts of society to address some of those concerns. But he didn't even invite the National Council for Women, which was one of the biggest organizations representing women, because their views were just opposite to theirs. So I wasn't surprised when the editor of a women's magazine who wore the hijab told me that she thought that the next revolution in Egypt would come from women. And certainly, I think, one of the factors that led to the anger that swelled up against the Muslim Brotherhood just before that government was brought down. Because there were protests that were purely women. And I had not seen that in Egypt before. And not just on International Women's Day, but on other days too. There were women that were putting together protests that were purely just women. But then came the military. They took over from the Muslim Brotherhood, installed their own government. So are things better, of course, is the natural question. Well, don't forget, this is the same power that conducted virginity tests for women who were hanging out in Tahrir Square as an intimidation tactics in the early days after Mubarak was ousted. And don't forget that women still continue to have fewer opportunities and less pay under this government as well. So to this day, when women get married, they relinquish control over any money they make. When they get pregnant, they relinquish control over their lives. And of course, all of this has cascade effects that limit women's participation in politics and in shaping their country's futures. And last thing I should mention is that, and it's purely this simple, is that life just isn't improving for young people. I've talked repeatedly about this. The reason all of this even started was because the Middle East has seen or is seeing one of the largest youth populations it has ever seen. It's a massive youth bulge everywhere you look. I mean, it's the ages between 18 and 34, I believe. It's one of the largest generations of young people the Middle East has ever seen. And the rallying cry, at least in Egypt, was bread, freedom, and social justice. And I think people in Egypt and just about everywhere in the Middle East would agree that they haven't achieved any of that. In Egypt, there is some improvement in the economy, but unemployment is still really high. And then we come back to the issue of Syria. Because what's happening there is not just happening to Syrians, and it's not just hampering progress in Syria, but it's also affecting the rest of the region as well. Because the conflict is inflamed, as I mentioned, sectarian divisions, and everything is being seen through that prism. Lebanon is directly affected by what's happening in Syria, as we mentioned. And there is also the matter of refugees who are all over the region now and taking up, sharing the infrastructure with people who live in those countries. So schools, hospitals, places to live are all under pressure all across the region, and certainly employment opportunities because of this huge influx of people. And the two countries that suffer the most from this are Lebanon and Jordan, of course, because they're right next door. So all these young people who had thought that this Arab Spring was going to bring change and there was going to be work opportunities and perhaps there would be fewer wars, that kind of thing, they're not getting anything. And so, in fact, as I've often said, they're looking for ways to get out. They still are, the way they were when I was still in the region. Now, having brought you, like, really down, brought myself down in the process, I thought I should, again, just mention that, I mean, I think about this quite a bit, and I have been accused of being too much of an optimist when it came to the Arab Spring. There were reasons for that. It's because I had watched the region plummet in spirit for years, and then just burst in joy, you know, for those first few months. And I was so convinced this was the answer. But now, of course, I've been brought down to earth watching what's happening. And I now see, though, signs that suggest, maybe not improvement, but at least things that we should be watching to get a sense if things are improving. And there are a few. And one which you can't dispute, and it's so simple, and people often forget about this, and I argue with people at work about this, is that millions of people in the region have found their voice. It's as simple as that. The army may be back in Egypt, for example, but people have higher expectations, and they know that if they're unhappy, they know what to do. They know where to go. Tahrir or somewhere else. And trust me, after what happened to Mubarak, the army is also very well aware that the street can turn on a dime. And they proved it themselves when they called on the street to come and to support their decision to bring down the Morsi government. So, and what's even more optimistic is that young people are actually not just going to the street and protesting, but they're getting involved beyond protest. I've seen signs of this every time I go there. Don't forget, it was 3 years ago that all this happened. And so all those teenagers who weren't really of age yet then, who were watching all of this happen, they're now kind of the next generation of activists who are now getting involved. They're coming to the fore. I'm seeing this. And this revolution captured their attention, their imagination. They are the ones who are now coming of age, and they're activist-minded, and they're sophisticated. I met this one young woman by the name of Rafaida in Cairo. I met her last year. She's 18 years old. She was involved in an organization that did media monitoring about how the press depicts women and how often women are mentioned in traditional roles compared to men in the press. And then she takes those clippings, this organization is quite smart, a group of young women, they take these clippings and then they go visit these newspapers and they demand meetings with the editors and they say, well, why are you showing this woman carrying a canister of gas, but meanwhile you're showing all these smart men in suits? Like why, like just about the depiction of women in the media and that kind of thing. So she was too young to be in Tahrir when all of this happened in 2011, but she's old enough to remember the virginity test. She's old enough to remember that anonymous woman, which you might remember, who was photographed in a blue bra being beaten up by security forces. So she has that image in her mind when she actually goes to protest squares now and helps with her organization to create corridors in those squares to make sure that women can pass safely and not get harassed by those thugs that come to Tahrir Square. She wants to be a human rights lawyer. That's what she told me. And I've met scores of young Egyptian women. It's not a scientific experiment or survey, but I've met scores of them, and they are all ambitious and smart, and they want to be all kinds of things, but I've never heard a young woman say, I want to be a human rights lawyer. And that, to me, is indicative of something. So I would watch that generation. I would watch the youngest taking on that huge job of making sure that there is progress. I'd watch out for this girl named Rafaida. I'm pretty sure one day she'll be making headlines. The second thing is that there is an incredible amount of debate going on in the Middle East right now, 300 million strong, because of the social media and what social media make possible. If there is a power, people said social media created Tahrir Square and made Tahrir Square possible. I'm not one of those people, but I think what it did do is allow the possibility for debate, which did not exist before. People can talk to each other across borders without any states getting involved, any governments getting involved. But you still can't discount the traditional press, and there are positive signs in that as well. Egypt does have more media than ever, which is why the government is looking for new tactics like blocking networks to curb their influence. Lebanon, of course, the home of endless debate and predictions. Even though each paper has its loyalties, has a huge number of newspapers. And together, if you read every paper, you kind of come up with some kind of truth. But the interesting thing about Lebanon's press is that it provides an outlet for what is happening in Syria, because Syria probably has one of the most impenetrable information ministries in the region. And so Lebanon has always been kind of a way for Syrians to be able to express their views unhindered. And now that Lebanon's actually involved, being dragged into this crisis, the press there is extremely important in discussing things that aren't discussed in Syria, like Hezbollah's involvement or, how the war is going, things that are not talked about in Syria. So this is crucial, obviously, as a forum to discuss these major issues, which wouldn't be discussed otherwise. Now, other things to look out for, I would say, one are signs of accountability. In Egypt's case, the case of Nahlah Ayed, which I mentioned, the young man who was killed by the police, those cops were actually not too long ago, were actually found guilty and sentenced to 10 years in prison, which I think most of us missed. Someone sent me the article. I hadn't seen it. There wasn't much coverage, but I think that's a huge deal. Because there is this sense in the Middle East, and as I mentioned, the rallying cries were about justice a lot of the time, that there is no justice, that no one ever gets caught. No one ever has to pay a price for what they do. And so the fact that these two policemen have now been sentenced to 10 years in prison, I think is probably for people in the region some sense that justice can be achieved. And another example of that, I would watch what is going on in Libya and the trials of former government figures there, for example. And whether anyone's ever held accountable for the killing of former Prime Minister Rafik Hariri in Lebanon. I think that's also something to watch out for. Of course, you saw that the tribunal has started. They've just began their preliminary meetings. And there has been a lot of criticism of that tribunal. It's cost a lot of money. Some people have said, who cares? It's 10 years, leave it alone. But the fact that it's even just starting has left many in Lebanon and beyond for them, it's hugely symbolic. Because as I say, it gives some sense that justice can be exacted even 10 years or 20 years later. Even if that trial never comes up with a verdict, I think it does have symbolic value. So I'd watch that. And the other thing I would watch is what's going on with Iran. You all saw John Kerry and Javad Zarif shaking hands in Geneva. You remember this? I think the possibility of Iran and the US coming up with some kind of deal is a huge, huge deal that could change everything in the Middle East. It could change things in Syria, it could change things in Lebanon, and even in Iran itself, obviously. Catherine Ashton is there at the moment. It's the first time that a European Union foreign policy chief has actually visited since 2008. And there's been a lot of criticism of her presence there, but there's also been a lot of optimism because it's a breaking of ice of sorts. Last but not least, I would say that I would watch how Western countries are reacting to what is happening in the Middle East. Are they just throwing their hands up and saying, well, this is too big a mess to get involved, or are they stepping up and trying to help in some way? And how they help. Are they just trying to throw money at the problem, or are they sharing expertise? Are they sending over technocrats to teach how courts work, or are they watching from afar and sending manuals? I think that's a real weather vane for how hopeful we should be about what's happening in the Middle East, and also how these countries react to that kind of offer of help. Are they accepting suggestions from Canada or from the US of sending technocrats over and teaching, how a courtroom works in Libya, let's say? So those are the kinds of things I think we should keep an eye on, and may indicate that things are changing in the region. So just a tiny bit of hope there to keep you happy, and a lot of things big and small to watch. But even with those, I think, could we predict what is going to unfold in the Middle East? No, definitely not. I used to pride myself on being able to predict what happens there, but I think just like any place that is undergoing huge change, there's a lot falling from the sky. And, you know, people in the region, as I said, they say that the earth shall receive them, but they're hoping that perhaps maybe one day it might just stop raining. Thank you.
I said at the outset of the evening that I thought a lot of our students looked on Nahlah as a role model, and I think you'll all understand why now. Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation, and thank you for coming. Good luck the rest of the time you're in Canada, and we'll be watching you when you head back to Ukraine to see what happens next. Thanks a lot. There's a reception outside. Please join us. Nahlah will be there. Marco will be there as well, and lots of other people around. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming tonight. I hope you've enjoyed the evening.